This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Most life science organizations understand that audits are a part of business in a regulated industry and ultimately should increase quality and efficiency. Still, audits often cause feelings of anxiety or uneasiness for fear of failures or even just fear of the unknown. Today, we're going to talk about ways in which medical device companies can prepare for audits, know what to expect during the audit, and how they should respond to audit findings. With us today to cover this topic is Alan Golden. Welcome back, Alan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Thanks to the IVT Network for inviting me. It's again an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Of course, it's always our pleasure. We do. You are a fan favorite in at our conferences, and we love to chat with you for the podcast as well. So Alan, we're going to dive right in because you do have a fair amount of information on the audit process, particularly for medical device companies. And I know it's so important for them to kind of get these things right and helps alleviate that fear up front for them. So before receiving notification of an actual audit, organizations can develop clear and concise FDA inspection procedures that allow them to maintain constant readiness. What, in your experience, 2 or 3 items are key in ensuring audit preparedness?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the most single important key item is to ensure that your site is always in compliance with all applicable regulations or guidance. If you have an overall culture of compliance, the rest is actually pretty easy, and you really don't worry about it if you know that you are in compliance all the time. Sure. The second most important thing would be the ability to quickly find all the documentation that you need to show that you're in compliance, because no one just takes your word for it. Auditors do not like to wait for things when they ask for something. So you need to have an organizational structure, a documentational structure, and people who understand how to get into it, find what they need quickly, and then get it to the auditor. If you have a poor documentation system, if stuff's scattered, if you have things stored off-site, if you have difficult computer systems, it just makes it much more tense. So those are the 2 big items before anyone shows up that you need to have in place.
And that makes complete sense, especially in terms of having the right procedures and the right systems in place, and knowing that all the documents you need are in there, and that you can find them quickly. In your experience, is this an area where you need to have some key personnel really trained up on this process, prior to the actual audit, or is it just or should it be sort of intuitive, I guess?
Both, actually. I mean, you have to have the systems in place. Your whole site needs to be in compliance, but you need people who are experienced at audits, and you need to, and we'll talk about that eventually, I think, to key the right people to be able to respond to the audit and have everything in place when needed.
So, thank you. That makes sense. And so ideally, that would happen well before you're even contacted.
Yep, all the time.
Once you know you have good systems and that your documentation is being placed in the correct area, I know some other tactics include compiling an inspection binder and stocking your inspection war room. And that allows for basic information to be accessible at all times for whoever might be involved in the audit. What items are essential to include here, both in the binder and in the war room?
So there are 3 that sort of need to be put in place. One of them is a list of all of your CAPA. Now, that normally is either from the last inspection until this inspection, It could be product specific if they're coming in for a product specific inspection or like a pre-approval inspection, or some other boundary. They'll give you a time frame, but they're going to want to see a list of all your CAPA. So if you can have that ready to go, that's a good thing. You don't have to go searching for it or compiling it. Another one they're going to want to see, or something you should have in the binder, is a list of all your customer complaints. And again, this could be product specific, from the last inspection, from some time frame. They're not going to ask for a list of your customer complaints for the last 30 years, but they're going to want some boundary. And then a list of all significant design changes. And I use the word significant in a very loose way. A lot of times, if you walk in to an auditor and say, these are my significant changes, they're going to ask you how you define significant. So that should be somewhere in a procedure someplace, but they're going to want to look at all your design changes or potentially manufacturing changes. And again, it could be from the last inspection, it could be product specific. And the reason these three things are important is this is a list of all of your dirty laundry in one place. Literally. Right. It's everything that's screwed up since the last inspection. All the auditor is going to do is look down that list and pick a couple to dive into. But if you
and Alan, it's been my experience that a lot of times people try to hide this. They think it's a bad thing, to have identified risks or CAPAs or any of these significant changes, that they don't want to. Sometimes they don't want to let the inspectors know because they think it reflects badly on them. But it's actually quite the opposite, right? When you have all of this stuff laid out ahead of time, they appreciate that, and then they can dive right into what did you do about it.
Exactly. And if the worst thing that can happen is if an auditor or an inspector thinks you're trying to hide something, because then they are going to dive down that rabbit hole, and it's just never a good situation. So, right. I mean, if you've got issues, okay, you're going to have to fess up to those issues. And it's never a good idea. First, we'll never lie, and it's never a good idea to try to hide stuff because they're going to find it. So you might as well, be clean about it. They'll appreciate it, and it will actually go better.
Right, and you turn those into learning opportunities for your whole team.
Yes, painful sometimes, but yes.
Exactly. Not the route you wanted to take sometimes, but there it is. So, Alan, speaking of the team, and we talked a little bit about having the right personnel know where to find documents and be able to access the systems. How can you assemble the best team for an audit? And how far ahead of the audit should you be thinking about this?
Oh, you should always be thinking about this. And some companies who are big enough will have a permanent audit team. These people are drawn upon every time there's an audit. If your division or your company is smaller, you're going to have to pull people off their regular work stream. But it's critical. The wrong audit team never leads to a good result, ever. And you need people in two places. You need people in the audit room with the auditor, and you need people in the back room or the staging room. People call it different things. In the room with the auditor, you need someone who can act as an administrator. This is the person who kind of keeps things moving, relays requests from the auditor to the staging room to get information, signs people in and out, just kind of keeps things moving in a general way. It also helps to have someone in the room, and let me back up. That person could be from quality or technical or regulatory. It really doesn't matter. And then you need someone in the room that I call a generalist. And this is someone who can answer questions the auditor may have, just kind of quick and dirty questions. Sure, they know enough about the product, the process, your quality system to be able to answer a quick audit question without necessarily bringing in documents or dragging in a subject matter expert. And again, this person can be from regulatory, technical, quality, manufacturing, as long as that person has good basic overall knowledge. And the third person in that room should be a scribe. This is someone who's going to be taking notes during the audit. They, again, should have general knowledge of your product processes. So you just don't want to grab an admin from someplace. They should be able to type, but you're not transcribing a word for word verbatim type of thing. It's not like a court recorder, but they should have enough knowledge to be able to get down significant questions. Who's in the room? What topics are being discussed? Are there any issues being discussed? And that typically is fed directly back to a screen in the staging room. So the person, and we'll get to the staging room personnel, that they monitor what's going on, and it can help them anticipate what may be the next thing coming up for them before the request comes through.
So important, right? So they can prepare even before that
room. Yeah. Or the back room, this is like the heart of the audit. This is where all the action takes place. And this is where you're going to fill audit requests. You're going to brief any subject matter experts before they go into the room. You're going to provide all the material for the auditors, quickly. Again, and this is where I usually spent most of my time, unless I was called in as an SME. And you're packed into a small conference room, typically with 10 or 11 of your closest friends for a week. With really bad snack food, and it's not exactly a nutritional situation. But you really need people in there from QA, from RA, technical, manufacturing, supply chain, design transfer potentially. Anyone who's got an expertise in a given area for that product or its process that's being audited. So if something comes through and they're looking for a design record, that request is going to go to the QA person. If something comes through and wants a regulatory record, that's going to go to the regulatory person. And they should have, of course, the ability to go into the right systems, find the right files, compile the information, and get it sent off to the audit room, which is done by probably the most important person in the room, which is the runner. There's usually someone in the room. Usually it's an intern or a new staff person who no one likes. And they're in the room to basically run things back and forth to the audit room, or sometimes multiple audit rooms. And we used to color code our printers different colors for different audit rooms, so we knew what audit room the request was coming from. So these people are very important and critical. And again, if your company is big enough, you may have permanent people that this is all they do.
Right.
But most companies don't. You get pulled off your regular work stream, and you're if it's a week audit, that's where you are for a week.
Right. Right. And that, I think, is where the majority of our audience is, right? They're just at that size where they don't have a permanent team, but they definitely have enough folks that they can assign temporarily to this. So, Alan, once we have the team assembled, aside from making sure the runner's wearing his Fitbit to get all the extra steps accounted for, we know the auditors are most definitely interested in speaking with the staff. It helps them to really ensure that each person, each member of the team has appropriate knowledge. What type of preparations should be taken with these employees?
So again, if it's a product-specific audit, you should certainly have like a pre-approval inspection. You should certainly have people from the technical and R&D teams queued up, that ready to go. And no one should be allowed into the audit room to speak to an auditor before they swing through the staging room to speak to someone about what they're going in to speak about, what materials they may need to bring in, what kind of mood the auditor is in. Are they a detail kind of auditor, or there's someone you can talk generally to? Also, no one should be allowed into an audit room until they have been trained in how to speak to an auditor. Auditors use and FDA inspectors use a variety of tricks and techniques to get you to tell them more than they're asking. And you should answer the question. You should answer the question fully. You should answer it honestly, but you should answer the question only. A lot of times they'll sit there and they'll pause, and then you want to fill that gap, and then you start talking and more stuff tumbles out, and it gives the auditor a chance to go down another rabbit hole. Answer the question. If the auditor wants more information, they will ask another question. So
that's a great tip.
Yeah, I mean, just answer the question. And if you don't know the answer, that's okay. You just tell the auditor, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question. I will find you someone who does. And that's a very legitimate answer. So people need to be trained to be able to feel comfortable giving that type of an answer, because not everybody knows everything.
Right.
So that's okay. Don't over answer, answer honestly, and don't ever let anyone walk in cold. I mean, I remember there were people who were technically excellent, very smart people. We never let them in front of an auditor because they would ramble for hours. And it's not what
I
you
know
want
some
people.
people like that. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Me. So you really want people to answer succinctly and carefully, but again, they should be swung through the audit room. The other thing that's very important is that if you are identified as a potential SME for an audit, you must be available. If
Right.
you're in a meeting and your phone goes off, you're done with the meeting. You run to the audit room. The auditor is not going to sit there and wait for you. You must be on site. If you cannot be on site, you must identify a replacement. So the staging room is going to have an SME list with cell phone numbers or office desk numbers, and you must be reachable immediately.
Sure. That makes sense. They like to do this in a timely fashion, of course.
Yes, nothing gets an auditor more angry than twiddling their thumbs.
Right. Wasting time. So, Alan, ideally you have time to prepare for this, right? So you're thinking about all of these things ahead of time. You may have your team earmarked for an audit. And it's always nice when we hear from the regulatory agency ahead of time and we know they're coming on X day of X month, but that's not always the case. Sometimes they just kind of show up or it's much shorter notice sometimes. So with that being said, how important is it to run mock inspections with the team to really solidify the team's ability to work together and be knowledgeable, as well as their ability to work with the regulators when that time comes?
That's a great question, and I cannot emphasize enough how important that is. First of all, mock audits, or what we used to call internal audits, which from corporate would come down and audit your division. Aside from being a huge pain, they are critically important. Because first of all, I would much rather have an internal auditor find an issue than an external auditor.
Absolutely.
Now I can correct it, and when the real audit comes in, there's no issues anymore. Right. Now, of course, anything you find ends up in CAPA. You have to deal with it. But
and disclose it, right?
Yeah, but at least then I didn't know that, and you can fix the problem. And it's the other thing about internal auditors is they already know all your dirty laundry. They're part of the same company, and they will really drill through things. And again, it's an unfun experience, but one I think is critical to make sure you are prepared for when the real auditor shows up. You can also run internal division audits, or within a department, you can run audits just to have someone say, okay, we're going to go and make sure that all of our documentation for our department is in perfect shape. You don't have to necessarily do it division or company-wide, depending on how big your company is. But mock audits are very important. Quizzing SMEs, getting them prepped with mock audits to make sure that they understand it's part of their training. It's a really critical thing to do. A lot of companies don't like doing it because it pulls people off their day jobs. You end up with more stuff in CAPA, which no one wants to deal with, but deal with it internally first so you don't have to deal with it when the FDA shows up.
Absolutely. No, I think it's critical that you know where your weak spots are and have a chance to address them before a regulator ever gets in the room. And for companies who don't want to, take the time to run the audit themselves, there are obviously consulting companies out there who can help move them through that process and identify where potential risks might be. So, I mean, it doesn't have to be so daunting, I suppose.
Right.
So, Alan, walk us then through day one of an audit. What should the company expect, and who needs to be present on that first day?
So what will happen is hopefully you've got it's an announced audit, like you mentioned, that the FDA tells you that they're showing up on day X, and they show up. Typically, it's around 9 a.m. I've never seen auditors get there much earlier than that. And whether it's from center or from a district office, or you've got an ISO audit and you've hired a firm to come in and do it, but the FDA will show up on day one and they will hand someone an FDA Form 482. That's their authority to conduct the audit. Somebody should meet them at the door. I mean, the receptionist or someone should call up to a designated person. They know they're ready to go. They run down. They should always be escorted. They're typically escorted to their audit room, one or more, depending on how they've set it up. They can drop their stuff and kind of set their computers up and get ready to go. And then remember also that the FDA cannot accept food. So they can accept coffee, water, tea, that type of thing, but they will not accept food.
Okay.
You can't feed them lunch. They usually go out for lunch. Now, that's not true for all auditors. So a lot of ISO auditors and other foreign regulatory bodies will come in and they'll eat whatever you give them. But the FDA, it's kind of, coffee is fine, but they're not going to take donuts. They're not going to take that stuff. You want it in the room, that's fine. Just realize they're not going to eat it.
Okay.
The next thing that's going to happen is an opening meeting. And this is where the firm will present to the auditors, even if they've been there a dozen times, they're going to get, this is what we do. These are the products that we make. This is what the factory looks like. They're going to get a presentation. At that opening meeting should be the highest ranking member of every significant department, as well as the highest ranking member of overall management at that company. And what that does is it ticks off a box. It ticks off the management responsibility box that we need to do per the Code of Federal Regulations. If you do not have upper management at that meeting, you could get a warning or a 483 observation for management responsibility. Because the auditor is going to think the management doesn't care about the audit. They don't have to be present in the staging room. They don't have to be in the audit room, but they better be at that opening meeting.
So just to clarify that a little bit, obviously, if you have a facility and everybody works in that facility, it might be very easy to get your CEO in the room as well as, the highest ranking member of every department. But what if you have a global company with multiple facilities and, your California facility is going through the audit, but your CEO might be in Switzerland? Is that person expected to come in for that? Okay.
You didn't need the highest ranking person at that facility.
At that facility. Perfect.
And you will be a plant manager, as an example. There will be a vice president or whatever, a divisional person. You don't need to fly in your CEO from overseas, but you need the highest
distinction, right? Because sometimes I was unclear what you meant by that. So I just wanted to clarify for everyone.
Great question. Thank you. Yeah, you just need the highest ranking people at that facility.
Sure.
Yeah. And the next thing
you have your whole management team there, and what else? What else are we looking at on day one?
So then they're going to probably do a facility tour. A lot of auditors want to see that the first day, the first morning. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're going to get that the second morning and they're going to go right into their audit. But my experience has been a lot of them want to do that facility tour that first day. It kind of takes up the first half day. And they should be escorted. Obviously, do not let them run loose throughout your factory.
That makes sense.
Limit the number of people going with them. Do not bring, an entourage of 30 people along with them, but there should be maybe the administrator, potentially the generalist, the scribe should be going along. And someone who's familiar with the facility should lead the tour. And that could be the principal site manager, the manufacturing manager, the R&D manager, but somebody should lead that tour. Understand they have access to everything. They have access to everyone. They also should be required to put on whatever appropriate gowning or PPE is required for any given room they go into. One of the easiest observations they will give you is if you walk into a room where the sign on the door says you must wear a lab coat, safety glasses, and a blah, 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 and you walk in without one.
Right.
You let the auditor in, that's an immediate write-up. Also, if they walk by a lab, and they see someone in the lab not wearing a lab coat, not wearing safety glasses, and that's what the sign says, you're going to get an observation for not following written directions. So your site should be aware that you need to be extra careful about making sure that all your personnel follow the right procedures. They can walk into the factory floor. They can ask any manufacturing person to explain what they're doing.
Right.
Again,
right. And ideally, as an organization, you should be following all your own procedures anyway.
Of course.
Even when it's not an audit process.
What they're looking for, and again, your factory personnel who are going to be on the floor that day should be coached, should be trained. Look, it's nervous. If someone's looking over your shoulder while you're doing your whatever prep you're doing, that's okay. Just continue doing what you're doing. They're not going to ask a tech in the factory complicated questions. It's going to be, what procedure are you following? Show it to me. So it's little things like that. But again, it can make people nervous. It shouldn't. Just do your job. And again, after the opening meeting, they'll usually then go back to their individual audit rooms or the audit room and begin the actual formal process. They may ask for documentation along the way. Oh, I'd like to see the cleaning procedure for this room. The scribe writes that down, and then when they get back to the audit room, they send that request, to the staging room, and they'll get it for them. So there may be requests that come along as the tour goes on. Usually it's for things like cleaning procedures or validations for different equipment. They'll see a big piece of equipment, like a fill line or something, and they'll ask, I'd like to see the validation, for that line.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. And they usually will not ask for that for every piece of equipment, but they'll pick and choose a few things that they want to look at to see how your procedures look and, like how detailed they are. And once they verify that you're doing everything well, they kind of move on, right?
Yeah, what you want is to say, yep, here's the procedure, here's what we did, here are the results, check, move on.
Exactly.
You need to be able to find all this stuff quickly, show it to the auditor, maybe bring an SME from validation in to walk through the process if it was a complicated one. But yeah, if you've got it all and you can show you've done it, check, and they move on.
Right. So, Alan, you mentioned, potentially getting a warning letter for forgetting to put neglecting to put on proper PPE or whatever. What are the other most common medical device compliance issues noted during audits in your experience?
So there are 4. Issues with change control is probably one of the biggest. So inadequate impact assessments, failure to verify or validate a change, inadequate risk management around a change. One of the things they want to look at your change control list is they want to take a look at some of those, and they'll find some complicated ones. And hopefully you've done a good impact assessment. You've looked at everything. But I've seen a lot of 483s come out of those. Okay. CAPA is another one. Inadequate investigations, a lot of no root cause discovered kind of conclusions, or every one of your CAPA is related to personnel, right? Everything was somebody screwed up. If that's happening too much, your training procedures are wrong. So CAPA is a big one. Bad investigations, not the right people, et cetera.
You have to do your due diligence there. That's expected for sure.
Oh, absolutely. Validation. Inadequate or no validations of your process, test methods, facilities, cleaning, computer software, whether it's customer facing or not. They're going to ask to look at those. If you have a process that isn't validated, they're going to ask you why it's not validated. Maybe you check every piece. It doesn't have to be validated, but usually most processes and test methods need to be validated. And then design, and for medical devices, design controls, inputs, product requirements, outputs, V&V, things not matching up, making sure that your outputs don't match your inputs, making sure you haven't verified all your product requirements or validated all your user needs. They're going to ask for that trace matrix typically, and you should have one of user need to product requirement to verification to validation, so that you can show them, yes, here's all our user needs, here's how we validated them, here's all our product requirements, here's how we verified them. And again, if they may dig into one or two of them a little bit, but if you've got that list and said, yep, we've done all of this, check, you're done. So those are the 4 big ones that I've seen. And there's other scattered stuff like training, people inadequate training, people with late training. We all loved doing training, spending hours looking at your computer, reading documents. But you need to keep up with that. They will ask for training records for any key personnel, especially people who are signing things and making decisions. They'll ask for training records for manufacturing people. How do you know that that person is qualified to do the task they're doing? And you have to show that they're trained appropriately. So
good to know.
I've seen 483s for training records also.
Sure. And that makes sense, because training your personnel on, especially the key personnel, very important to reducing risk from human error.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Alan, you mentioned CAPA, and a major issue for medical device companies historically has been the inadequately established CAPA procedures. You may get a warning letter on that, or you may not, but still, or a lack of documentation around CAPA. So, why do we see so many issues in this area?
In a short sentence, CAPA is a pain. I mean, it's the only way I can put it. No one wants to do it. Most companies don't put enough effort into CAPA. And unfortunately, this leads to inadequate investigations, inadequate CAPA actions, inadequate effectivity checks, inadequate preventive and corrective actions. I mean, all of this stuff leads to audit findings. So if you have a problem and you don't correct it, or you don't correct it adequately, or you don't determine whether or not it's global or not. You don't take any kind of preventive action to assume it's not going to happen globally again. I mean, and you have to document all this. You have to have a thorough investigation. And whatever tools you use, whether it's the 5 Whys or the 5 Ms or whatever tools that you use for CAPA, you should have a good procedure to do it. And you should have a staff that does those investigations. You should have people. I think it's best to have people dedicated to it. You should have some people in QA who do nothing but manage that CAPA from a quality perspective. It's nice to have technical people who do nothing but CAPA. A lot of companies don't do that or can't do that. But CAPA is important. Yes, routine production is important. You have to get product out the door. But if you do not address the CAPA, you are just asking for trouble come the next audit, because it's something they are going to look at. And again, if you're not addressing your CAPAs, this is potentially a cause for product removal from market, because you may have adulterated product according to the regulators.
Absolutely. I mean, you really need a team, even if it's just an individual, that is good at really digging in and getting to the root cause of that issue, because just putting a Band-Aid on it and fixing it temporarily, or fixing the symptom, so to speak, but not actually addressing the actual problem, is really potentially going to lead to, manufacturing issues, product quality issues, and as you mentioned, ultimately that can lead to the regulators stopping manufacture. And that's downtime like that for a company, I would think, is very detrimental.
Yeah, you'll get a phone call from the head of marketing and sales as to, why aren't you shipping product? Customers get a little upset when they can't get the products that they need. It's not a great career move.
For sure. So, Alan, following the audit, there should be a team designated to provide responses to any of the findings that might come out of that actual exercise. So how do you assemble that team, and are members from the audit team included there or not? And what are the primary goals in developing a response?
Yeah, this is a place no company wants to be. I mean, you'd like to go through an audit with no observations, everything's great, and then you go back to your life. If you do end up with an observation, and the FDA puts those on a Form 483, which you're going to get regardless. It may have observations on it or not. Hopefully it doesn't. But if it does, you're going to get that when they leave. So you know what your observations are. We'll talk about...
Hope for a short list.
Hopefully it's no list, but I've seen long ones. You need to assemble a team immediately to deal with these. And we'll talk about timing in a minute, but you need people from QA, RA, certainly. So quality, regulatory, medical writing, if you have that function, because you're going to have to write a written response.
Sure.
Technical, potentially manufacturing, and those areas will depend on what the 483 observation was about. Is it something in manufacturing? Is it something from R&D? Is it something from CAPA? You bring those experts in. You don't need everybody. And these people may or may not be the same personnel who were part of the audit. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not.
Right.
And again, your primary goal is you need to develop a response to the observations. How are you going to address those observations, and a timeline for doing so? That is critical, because you may be able to address them very quickly, and that's great, but you may not. If you need to reopen a CAPA investigation, if you need to redo a validation, it's not going to happen in a week. So what's your timeline? And that timeline needs to be realistic yet aggressive. I guess that's the best way I can put it.
Yeah, you're getting it done as soon as possible, but within reason, right?
Right. I mean, you can't tell someone you're going to do an entire filling line validation in 2 days. I mean, because then you're going to miss the
regulators know that.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So, with that in mind, are there any tools or templates or things of that nature available to assist teams in completing that response? Yeah,
there are templates available online. You can also enlist the services of consultants who have lots of experience in this. They can come in and help you set up these. I know companies that actually have audit observation consultants in their speed dial, right? They just seriously, they have almost on retainer to get them in the building. You can also go to the FDA website, because the FDA publishes all warning letters. And you can look at the response. So if you've responded to a 483 and the FDA doesn't think it's an adequate response, you're going to get a warning letter. And they will explain in that warning letter why your response wasn't any good or why they didn't accept it. So you can look at those and go, oh, we probably need to not do this.
Right.
So it's a great way to kind of get an idea of how to write them. Again, the important thing is to address the observation clearly with data to back up any correction. So if you've made a quick correction, here's the data that back that up, and a reasonable timeline if you can't correct it quickly.
Okay. And so how much time do you have to do this? How quickly do responses need to be submitted? And what kind of follow-up, if any, is needed once you've done the submission of your response?
You don't have a lot of time. You have 15 working days from when you get the observation to respond to it. And this timeline is not negotiable.
So 3 weeks maximum, right?
Yeah. And typically it's 3 weeks of your life you're never going to get back if you are working on one of these responses, because you're there constantly to get this done. The FDA will either then consider the response adequate, whether it corrects the problem or they accept your timeline for correcting the issue.
For correcting, sure.
Or not. Again, if they think it's okay, you may get something from the FDA that says it's okay. If you don't hear from them within 30 days, you should contact them and say, hey, we sent the observation, our response in, what's going on?
You can't just assume that it's been accepted if you haven't heard.
Most of the time they will respond, but sometimes they don't. But get a hold of them. If your response is not satisfactory, then the FDA is going to issue a warning. They may come back with questions. So there may be some back and forth. They may not immediately say, no, this is no good or this is great. They may come back with some questions, and that's great. It's better than saying no immediately. But if they really don't accept your response to the observation, they're going to submit a warning letter, which is never a good place to be. Because again, remember, they're published, your competitors see them, your customers see them. Now, other regulatory bodies may have different timings. I'm just focusing on the FDA. You need to make sure that you ask that question of your auditor or your investigator before they leave. How much time do I have to respond? And they'll tell you. So again, not every organization has that 15-day window.
Sure. And that makes sense. It sounds like the important piece is that you keep the lines of communication open between you and the FDA, so that you understand, where they are in the process of reviewing and what questions you might be able to answer for them.
Agree completely. Yes. I mean, a lot of people are scared of calling the FDA.
Right.
Call the FDA. They will answer your questions. And it's much better to get that clarification than to submit something they're not going to accept.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Proactive is always better than reactive.
Always.
So, Alan, an interesting question for you. Based on COVID-19, and we've had all of these emergency use authorizations, and we've all read of the FDA's commitment to not auditing certain pieces or certain things that have been going on during COVID-19. But obviously, at some point, we're going to go back to normal. And what kind of impact do you think that COVID-19 based EUAs will play on audit findings as we move into 2021?
So, as you mentioned, EUAs are a much lower bar. An emergency use authorization, if you read the guidance from the FDA, it's like 4 pages. There's not much you have to do. You do have to show some things, but it's not that much. But it's a much lower bar of approval than a regular diagnostic test, vaccine or therapeutic.
Sure.
Now, I would think that at some point, a lot of these companies who have a new diagnostic on the market are going to want full approval of that diagnostic at some point, which means they're going to have to go back and ensure that everything is in place to get a full pre-market approval of that product. I mean, right now, everyone's kind of running on, yeah, we'll get it out the door. And I've worked on EUAs before, and there's just not that much you have to do. You've got to show they work, and that's pretty much it. No design control. There's no massive documentation. But eventually, they're going to want to, I would assume, to continue to sell the product once the crisis is over, they're going to want to go back and get a full approval. So how much work that will be depends on how much work they've done up front and how much they're going to have to go back and redo. I know that a lot of companies went gangbusters to get this stuff out the door, and there's been a lot of post-market changes that have taken place as they've gotten more data in that they didn't have initially from the market, and they've made a lot of tweaks and things. So, but eventually, I think a lot of these companies are going to want full approval of this product to have as routine lab testing it, or at some point, once we're all not waiting in line for 5 hours in our cars to get a COVID test.
Right. Absolutely. And hopefully, if this is a product that they want to continue manufacturing, they have been using their same process, right, for testing and production, et cetera, that they would use in non-COVID times. And that's going to make their life a lot easier when they actually have to show better documentation and other pieces that regulators will be looking for.
Absolutely. Eventually, it's going to have to look like every other submission.
Exactly.
With all the bells and whistles.
So I guess we'll see. We'll see what impact, if we're going to see a rise in warning letters, or if we're going to see companies really have to stop manufacturing and take time to, redo some processes, procedures, et cetera. But
time will tell.
Time will tell, for sure. Yeah. Excellent. Well, Alan, it's been great learning all of these different pieces of effective audits for medical devices this week. In closing, I'm going to ask you to recap the most important elements of audit preparedness and remind our listeners what 2 things they can do in their company today to put themselves in a better position in terms of audit readiness. So,
again, it's been a pleasure giving the podcast with you. First of all, the most important thing is always be in a current state of compliance. If you are in a current state of compliance all the time, if your company culture is a compliance culture, you're in great shape. You don't panic, don't worry about it. Never cut corners on compliance, ever. I mean, that's the worst thing you can do because you're going to be playing catch up later. Have a robust documentation system for everything that you do and for all your processes. Ensure audit readiness at all times. And this means people have audit training as part of their regular training schedules, people who normally are involved in audits, so that you are always ready for audits, that you keep a list of CAPA, that you keep a list of change control, that you keep a list of complaints, that you don't have to generate it every time from scratch. You just keep adding to the list, and you can just cut it off where they need to.
Sure.
Again, have a system where your documents can be found and retrieved quickly, that auditors don't have to wait days to get a packet of material. I mean, some auditors will look at it on a screen. You don't necessarily have to bring in paper. Some auditors require paper. Ask. I mean, if you don't have to
know that up front, right? You can ask those questions up front for a list of documents and other items that they have that they expect.
Also ask if they want to see it on a screen or on paper. I mean, if you don't have to deforest the Pacific Northwest every time you have an audit, that would be a great thing, because you can burn tons of paper. And again, have a trained audit team. Have people that you can go to, whether they're permanent or people you're going to pull off a regular work stream, that know how to do audits. And it used to be a real joke every time we'd have an audit. Oh, look, it's the usual suspects back in the staging room again. It was always the same people, but we had it down. We knew what we needed to do. We got things done quickly. And many, many times, and at the end of the audit, the closing meeting, auditors would actually compliment the staging room at how quickly and accurately they were able to fill requests. And that's what you want to hear. So a good trained team is a good thing. So the most important points really is really one, which is be in a current state of compliance always. And
fair enough. Makes your life a lot easier.
Makes everybody's life a lot easier.
Excellent. Well, Alan, some really great tips today. I thank you so much for taking time with us to share your expertise and really help our fellow medical device manufacturers be better prepared for an audit and really work towards being in a constant state of compliance. It's been a pleasure to have you with us.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you again for the invitation. And
of course.
I look forward to doing this again at some point in the future.
And you know you will. We really appreciate it. Hey, I also want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. And lastly, a big thank you to you, our valued listeners. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we would welcome your emails and messages about that. If you enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice. And don't forget to share with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. We really do appreciate your help getting the word out there and sharing these very informative podcast episodes. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. And we'll be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, stay healthy and safe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.